We are Death Penalty Group 1. The death penalty has been around since colonial times, with the first death penalty being recorded in 1608 in Jamestown. These started out as public killings that would often be events meant to embarrass and bring shame to whoever committed the crime and their family. The original deaths were very brutal, including hangings, burning at the stake, or beheadings.
Following along with what Joey taught us about the basics of the death penalty, I wanted to talk about the evolution of the death penalty through all of its years of use. The death penalty was first used in the 18th century BCE in Babylon, used in the Code of King Hammurabi, who is very well known for an eye for an eye, which means anything you do to someone, you get the exact same punishment back. The death penalty was used since then, and a quite harsh example of this was in 7th century BCE in the Draconian Code, in which death was the only punishment for crimes. The death sentences given were mainly crucifixion, drowning, beating, burning alive, or impalement. Hanging was used most well known, especially in the 10th century, by England. The most people killed in one single king's rulings was Henry VIII, who killed 72,000 people, which is almost twice the population of FSU's student body. Over 200 crimes in medieval England allowed for capital punishment, including cutting down a tree, which I find quite interesting. After England's use of the death penalty for so long, it influenced the new American country to follow along using it from colonization. Following along with that, in the 19th century, states reduced the number of death penalties and instead instituted state penitentiary or jails. Finally, in 1834, death penalties were starting to be done in private instead of for public viewing. In 1846, Michigan made the death penalty illegal, except for in cases of treason, and in the early 1900s, death penalties were only used for treason and the murder of police. In 1924, gas was used to carry out the death penalty, and this was because it was seen as a much more humane way of killing people instead of hanging them. In the 1930s, executions again were popular because criminologists said that the death penalty was necessary, and Prohibition and the Great Depression led to a lot more capital punishments being given. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was a cruel and unusual punishment, making it unconstitutional, and instead of outlawing the death penalty, they instead tried to looking for better ways to execute the death penalty, instead of making it extremely cruel and brutal. Rulings in the 1970s Supreme Court cases Furman v. Georgia that the way specific death penalties were carried out were unconstitutional, not them as a whole.
The death penalty evolution through the years. The death penalty has been reinstated in many ways, but the ways about killing people were changed. In 1994, Clinton signed a bill allowing 60 crimes to lead to a death penalty. The death penalty was originally banned in the 70s, but was later repealed. Nowadays, the death penalty is given for murder of a government official, kidnapping resulting in death, running a drug enterprise, and treason.
How and why the death penalty was started. One of the earliest written documents that supported the death penalty was the Code of Hammurabi, which was written on stone tablets around 1760 BC. The stone contained the theory of eye for an eye as death penalty justification. It was invented to try and deter other people from committing the same crimes. Previously, death penalties were executed publicly to further deter others from committing crimes, while using the guillotine and hanging to do so.
We've prepared a video for you to watch about the death penalty.
The death penalty, also known as capital punishment, can be used for crimes involving murder. Today, many states allow the death penalty. 24 states use it, 23 don't allow it, and 3 have a current moratorium or temporary hold on it. Since 1976, there have been 1,532 executions in total. The main method used is lethal injection, but other methods used in the past have been electrocution, hanging, death by firing squad, and gassing. The death penalty in America was influenced by England. The first person to be killed in the US was Captain George Kendall in 1608, who was put to death by firing squad for serving as a Spanish spy. Since those early days, various high court rulings have placed limits on the death penalty. In 1972, the Supreme Court declared the death penalty a cruel and unusual punishment that violated the Eighth Amendment. For the next 4 years, no executions were carried out at the state or federal levels. But in 1976, the Supreme Court decided to allow it again, but with appellate review, meaning a higher court must review the decision of lower courts. The death penalty resumed the following year. In the 2000s, Supreme Court rulings abolished the death penalty for young people and people with intellectual disabilities. While the majority of people executed since 1976 have been white, a disproportionate number have been black. Black people make up about 13% of the population, but 42% of people on death row. The death penalty has also been criticized for putting innocent people on death row and for not serving as a deterrent to crime. The death penalty isn't cheap either. Defending a person facing the death penalty costs on average over $600,000 in a federal trial, about 8 times more than if the death penalty wasn't sought. This is because of longer trials and appeals when a person's life is on the line.
My part in this project was looking at the Christian primary sources, which came mainly from the Bible. The quotes for the death penalty were Genesis 9:16, which said, "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind." Another quote, Exodus 21:12, says, "Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death." Following that, Leviticus 24:17 says that anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. These 3 quotes show that killing someone isn't a crime against another person, but against God. Punishment must be serious in response to killing someone else, because it is in the likeness of God again. And most of these quotes were used in the legal justice system in Israel, and they were used to maintain order throughout the state. Another quote from the New Testament for the death penalty is Romans 13:4, which says, "For he is God's servant for your good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." So this quote, which was written by Apostle Paul, defends government's roles for serving justice. The sword that they talk about in the reading was the execution power and the support of the capital punishment. Paul wrote this while living in the Roman Empire, who used the death penalty, and the servant of God discussed in this is the means that executions are done on God's behalf for sins. Although there are many instances in the Bible that are for the death penalty, there are also ones against it. These quotes are Exodus 20:13, which is a 10th commandment, says that you shall not murder. And Ezekiel 33:11, which says, "Say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, people of Israel?" Both these quotes show that God wants to protect all human life no matter what the sins were committed, and God is merciful for people who no matter what sins they have committed. This quote from John 8:7-11 shows Jesus' actions regarding the death penalty when he says, "When they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, 'Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her.' Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, 'Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?' She said, 'No, sir.' 'Then neither do I condemn you,' Jesus declared. 'Go now and live your life of sin.'" Jesus knows that the lady is guilty in this, but he believes that she can turn her life around and stop going towards sin.
What are secondary sources in religious ethics? Secondary sources are interpretations or ethical arguments made by scholars, theologians, or religious institutions. Secondary sources help us understand how Christians interpret scripture and theology in modern ethical debates. In this presentation, I'll cover how 2 Christian secondary sources, one from Charles Colson and one from the United Methodist Church, take opposite sides on the issue of the death penalty. For the death penalty, Charles Colson, Justice That Restores. Colson, a former Nixon aide turned evangelical Christian prison reform advocate, defends justice with accountability. He argues the death penalty is morally justified in extreme cases to preserve moral order, reflecting biblical justice, particularly from the Old Testament. He claims that justice must involve consequences that fit the crime, especially for murder, referencing Genesis 9:6. "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed." Colson does not advocate vengeance. He emphasizes moral responsibility and restitution. He believes the state has authority from God to wield the sword when necessary. Romans 13. He also concerned with the dignity of the victim, not just the rehabilitation of the offender. Against the death penalty, United Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church completely opposes the death penalty as a matter of Christian witness to the sanctity of life. Their General Board of Church and Society emphasizes Jesus' teachings on mercy, forgiveness, and nonviolence, pointing especially to the Sermon on the Mount. They argue the death penalty disproportionately affects the poor and people of color, contradicting the Christian commitment to justice and equity. The Church believes only God has the authority to take life, and that redemption is always possible, even for the guilty. The death penalty is viewed as a failure to imagine moral transformation and ignores Jesus' model of grace and restoration. Comparison of the two Christian perspectives. Colson and the United Methodist Church draw from the same scriptures, but interpret justice and divine authority very differently. Colson sees justice as structured and consequential. Punishment has theological significance. The Methodist Church sees justice as restorative and life-affirming, more reflective of Christ's grace. This shows Christianity is not monolithic. Different denominations prioritize different theological values, like retributive justice versus mercy, or moral order versus redemption. Can justice and mercy coexist in Christian support for the death penalty? If Jesus taught, turn the other cheek, can the state still be justified in using the death penalty under Christian ethics? This concludes the Christian secondary sources. Next, we'll explore how Islamic ethical tradition handles the same issue.
The Quran is the main religious text in the Islamic religion and is believed to be a collection of verses revealed to Muhammad by Allah through the angel Gabriel. Muhammad's scribes recorded these messages, and they were often told orally, and these messages in the stories, but then were later compiled through Muhammad's scribes to make up the book that is known as the Quran. The divine messages sent to Muhammad were intended to be a code of conduct for Muslims, a way to live your life as a good Muslim. Some of the key themes expressed in the Quran are the gifts of Allah, the laws and codes of being a Muslim, death and afterlife, and how one's belief guides them through life. So the Quran is meant to be kind of like a railroad in life for Muslims of how they should act, what they can expect from this, and how this belief can change their life and bring them prosper. The Quran is the guiding principles which align the Muslim faith and is seen as an absolute authority. The pro-death penalty argument for primary sources in Islam, which is the Quran, is used in is mainly referred to as the verses. Like the verses are used as the pro-death penalty argument. In the Quran 49, they wish that you should disbelieve as they disbelieve, and then you would be equal. Therefore, take not to yourselves friends of them until they emigrate in the way of God. Then, if they turn their backs, take them and slay them wherever you find them. Take not to yourselves any one of them as a friend or helper. The violent sense of this message does not align with most traditions, but is very common in Islamic belief. The Quran is an absolute authority in the Islamic religion, and especially in certain states which practice Sharia law, which is the law of the Quran. The Quran not only supports the death penalty, but calls for it as the appropriate punishment. So what it's saying here is that, therefore take not to yourself friends of them until they emigrate in the way of God. If someone does not respect Allah and does not convert to Islam, then they should be slain and not be taken as friend or helper. Some people argue a literal versus figurative reading of the Quran, that the Quran is meant to be read kind of as a metaphor. However, this verse seems pretty open and shut that if this happens, the correct action is to kill them. Muhammad even practiced this when he was at war, conquering nations, killing many people. Another quote from the Quran is in Quran 5:33. Indeed, the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and spread mischief in the land is death, crucifixion, cutting off their hands and feet on opposite sides, or exile from the land. This penalty is a disgrace for them in this world, and they will suffer tremendous punishment in the hereafter. this is very open shut. It is simple that if someone disrespects religion, that this is what should happen and that they should be killed. This was used historically as a way to kill prisoners, that they believed that this was why, especially during the Crusades, that like a verse such as this was why they had the right to kill prisoners of war. The anti-death penalty argument is a verse in the Quran that says 42:40, and the retribution for an evil act is an evil one like it. But whoever pardons and makes reconciliation, his reward is due from Allah. Indeed, he does not like wrongdoers. So this is stressing the forgiveness that is expressed in the Quran and the importance of life. Many people believe that they do not have the right to punish people, and that is a right reserved for Allah in the afterlife, and that the death penalty is taking the place of Allah. Muhammad, when he conquered Mecca, even forgave the people who had treated him so horribly and let them live.
Islamic opinions secondary sources. These secondary sources will further evaluate Quran 489 and Quran 533. The following will talk about Quran 489. Declan O'Sullivan from the Journal of Quranic Studies, which analyzes the Quran through different perspectives. Ben Clark from the University of Notre Dame, Australia, from the Adelaide Law Review. And these scholars will talk about Quran 533. Sud Sareem Karimullah, Nanda Ahmed Basuki, and Arif Sugatanada from an ethical analysis of the application of the death penalty in Islamic law. Declan O'Sullivan from the article Acts of Blasphemy Against Islam by Muslims in Egypt. Is the death penalty written in the Quran? Declan O'Sullivan from the Journal of Quranic Studies talks about Muhammad Ali and how he believes Quran 489 should be understood as so, showing clearly that even waverers were not to be killed or fought against if they refrained from fighting, though they may have gone over to unbelief after accepting Islam. The logic of disusing the punishment of death for apostates from this ayah is as absurd as that which seeks to draw a similar conclusion from 2217. The commentators agree that the persons referred to in this ayah were unbelievers and not Muslims. O'Sullivan says that there is a clear message here within which Muslims are instructed how to react against hypocrites who pretend to be genuine believers, no matter how offensive their behavior is, as long as it is not a physical attack. He says to be patient with them and wait for them to receive the message of truth with connection to God. He's basically saying that Quran 489 is against the death penalty. So Quran verse 489 interpreted this way is shown against the death penalty. Ben Clark believes that Quran 489 is misapplied when being used as justification for the death penalty. Clark says the verse addresses treasonous behavior and how it talks about turning away, not more violence. Clark says the verse is misapplied as an unnecessary usage for violence against apostates. He also says traditional jurists have overextended the verse's meaning, and he argues that the verse itself refers to war and sedition, not religious belief, so further emphasizing that it is not advocating for the death penalty. These sources talk about being for the death penalty, so in an ethical analysis of the application of the death penalty in Islamic law, it says that the death penalty is prescribed. It outlines the punishment for those who fight against Allah and His Messenger and seek to cause corruption on earth, mentioning the sentence of death or crucifixion, cutting off hands and feet from opposite directions, or expulsion. Arguing that the verse 533 calls for harsh punishment for those who commit crimes threatening social security and stability. Many traditions have specific practices where the death penalty is a legitimate measure, but even though the death penalty is prescribed in these circumstances, there is equal encouragement from Muhammad for forgiveness. Continuing on with advocating for the death penalty, Declan O'Sullivan talks about blasphemy and how the verse 533 in the Quran addresses it. O'Sullivan says that while it is not directly addressed in verse 533, interpretations have led people to believe the death penalty is applicable in blasphemy cases, and while the Quran does not directly apply the death penalty for blasphemy, it does for other cases like apostasy, treason, and public rebellion. Here are the citations for the context of the death penalty.